The silence of my old house had become a suffocating blanket, heavy and cold. Every breath I took felt like an intrusion, a rude awakening in a place meant for hushed memories. It had been months since the accident, months since the world had tilted on its axis and spilled all the color from my life. The architect in me, the one who once found joy in precise lines and elegant forms, was a ghost, wandering through the ruins of my own making. My hands, once so steady, now trembled when I tried to sketch, the graphite smudging, the paper tearing. I looked at the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a vibrant smile, a child's infectious laugh. It was a wound that refused to close, festering with every passing day. Friends, colleagues, they all offered condolences, hushed words, and pitying glances. I needed to escape, not just the house, but the city, the sympathetic whispers, the constant, crushing weight of everything that reminded me of what I'd lost. Blackwood Manor. My great-aunt's sprawling, isolated estate, nestled deep in the forgotten corners of the countryside. It was a folly, a grand, decaying monument to a bygone era, but it was also empty. And emptiness, I realized, was exactly what I craved. A place where my own profound emptiness wouldn't feel out of place. I could lose myself in its restoration, I thought. Give my hands, my mind, a purpose that wasn't tied to grief. The drive felt endless. The city lights receded into a faint glow, replaced by the inky blackness of the winding country roads. The trees grew taller, denser, their branches clawing at the overcast sky. The air thickened, carrying the damp scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. My phone had lost signal miles back, severing the last fragile tether to the world I was fleeing. I was truly alone now. When I finally saw Blackwood Manor, it was less a sight and more an impression. A hulking silhouette against the bruised twilight, its sharp gables and crumbling turrets like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. The wrought iron gates, rusted and half off their hinges, groaned a protest as I pushed them open. The graveled driveway, choked with weeds, crunched under the tires, announcing my arrival to an audience of silent, ancient trees. The manor stood, vast and desolate, a testament to faded grandeur. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy stone brows, reflecting nothing but the gathering night. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the unseen wind. The air here was different, heavier, carrying a faint, musty odor I couldn't quite place, something like damp earth mixed with old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. Stepping out, I felt the rough texture of the overgrown path beneath my boots. The front door, a massive slab of weathered oak, bore the scars of time and neglect. The brass knocker, tarnished beyond recognition, felt icy under my gloved hand. The key, a heavy, ornate piece of iron, grated in the lock, and with a final, echoing thunk, the door swung inward. I fumbled for the flashlight, its beam cutting a swathe through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. Cobwebs, thick as old lace, draped from every chandelier and corner. My footsteps echoed, each sound magnified, swallowed, then spat back at me by the vast, empty space. I spent the first few hours just walking, flashlight in hand, trying to map out the labyrinthine interior. Room after room, each one a tableau of decay, faded tapestries, furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering giants, fireplaces choked with generations of soot. I told myself it was beautiful, a challenge, a canvas for my grief to finally find an outlet. I could feel the house, a living, breathing entity, settling around me, groaning and creaking as the temperature shifted with the encroaching night. Or maybe it was just the wind. The manor was huge, but the estate itself was enormous, sprawling into a thick, untamed forest. Beyond. The main house, nestled amongst a cluster of ancient, gnarled oaks, stood a low, squat building I hadn't noticed from the driveway. It looked like an old stable block, repurposed perhaps. Its stone walls were thick, windowless on the side facing me, and roofed with heavy slate. I pushed open a heavy wooden door that groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a short, dim corridor. The smell was stronger here, that metallic tang, almost like old blood mixed with iron. The air was dead still. Along one side of the corridor, a series of identical, heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands, were set into the stone wall. No windows, no handles on the outside. They looked less like stable doors and more like something else. Curiosity, a fragile flicker in my otherwise numb existence, compelled me forward. A small, rusty latch, almost hidden, was set into the frame. The door swung inward with a faint sigh, revealing a small, utterly bare room. Stone walls, stone floor, no window. A single, rusted iron ring was bolted to the far wall. It wasn't a stable stall. It wasn't a storage room. This was a segregation unit isolation cell. The phrase echoed in my mind. Why would an ancestral manor have something like this? I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps for difficult servants, centuries ago? Or a rudimentary local jail during some forgotten conflict? It felt too deliberate, too severe for either. I pushed the door shut, the latch clicking with a finality that sent a fresh shiver through me. Less empty, more watchful. This place wasn't just old. It felt hungry. The silence had been a heavy shroud, but I was determined to tear it away. The first thing I did was buy tools, not just any tools, but solid, heavy-duty implements that felt good in my hands. Hammers, chisels, saws, crowbars, a sturdy dust mask, and industrial-strength cleaning supplies. It was the only way I knew how to fight back against the emptiness that had settled in my chest, a hollow ache that echoed the quiet of Blackwood Manor. My initial attack was on the dust. Layers of it, thick as velvet, coated every surface. I started in the main hall, sweeping, scrubbing, and wiping away decades of neglect. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a dull throb in my muscles that temporarily eclipsed the sharp stab of memory. The house groaned under my ministrations, old timbers sighing, floorboards creaking in protest, or perhaps, I thought, in a strange kind of welcome. As the days bled into weeks, a rhythm began to form. I'd wake with the sun, eat a simple breakfast, and dive into the work. The house was enormous, a labyrinth of rooms I was slowly charting. I started making lists, cracked plaster in the drawing room, rotted sills in the library, a perpetually dripping faucet in what I assumed was once the scullery. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. Sometimes, when I was alone, deep in thought, scraping paint from an old doorframe, I'd hear it. I'd freeze, my hand still, straining to catch it again. Nothing. I'd shake my head, blaming it on fatigue, on the wind finding its way through broken panes. Grief, I knew, played tricks on the mind. Distinct patches of air, suddenly frigid, as if someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of a room. I'd be working, warm from exertion, and step into an invisible pocket of icy air that raised gooseflesh on my arms. It wasn't a draft, the air around it would be still. The house was old, after all, full of quirks. Fleeting, darting movements at the periphery of my vision. A flicker in the dim light of a hallway, a shape melting into the gloom of a corner. I'd snap my head around, my heart giving a little lurch, but there would be nothing there. Just the familiar, heavy furniture, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. My eyes, I reasoned, were playing tricks on me, tired from hours of focused work, perhaps oversensitive to the shifting light in the cavernous rooms. The rationalizations worked for a while, a thin shield against a growing unease. They seemed to coalesce, to hold their form for a fraction of a second longer, hinting at something tall and gaunt before dissolving. One afternoon, I was trying to map out the deepest parts of the cellar. The doorways were narrow, the ceilings low. Each cell-like space had a heavy, iron-bound door, long rusted shut, and a single, small ventilation grate set high in the wall. As I stood there, a terrible, suffocating weight pressed down on me. I wasn't just observing these remnants of a cruel past, I felt it, a profound sense of being watched. The air in the cellar grew heavy, thick, and still, as if holding its breath. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a very long time. The house wasn't just settling, it was stirring. And whatever was stirring within Blackwood Manor, it knew I was here, and it was watching. The heavy tools I'd bought felt like extensions of my will. Hammers, chisels, crowbars, they were instruments of demolition and rebirth. I attacked the manor with a furious energy, a desperate need to tear down the layers of neglect and decay that mirrored the rot in my own soul. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminated by my efforts. I spent days scraping peeling wallpaper from the walls of what used to be the main drawing room, the cloying scent of mildew and damp plaster clinging to my clothes. The physical exertion was a balm, a way to exhaust my body enough that, for a few hours, my mind might grant me a reprieve from the constant ache of loss. But the silence. The silence was never truly silent. It was a breathing thing, filled with the groans of old timber, the whisper of drafts through broken panes, the scuttle of unseen things in the walls. Yet, sometimes, a different sound would cut through the mundane creaks. A faint, bell-like laugh, so fleeting I doubt I'd heard it at all. A soft hum, a melody that almost, resolved into a lullaby. My breath would hitch, my hands pausing mid-scrape, listening, but then, nothing. Only the manor's usual mournful sighs. I'd shake my head, blaming my grief, my exhaustion, the cruel tricks my memory played. It was choked with cobwebs and the skeletal remains of forgotten furniture, smelling of stagnant air and something metallic, like old pennies. I strained my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I would hear the light patter of small feet. But there was nothing. I slowly walked towards the wardrobe, my eyes scanning the gloom, half expecting to see a flash of a small, bright dress. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, a phantom limb of my grief. But the sound had been so real, so vibrant, so utterly hers. Was I losing my grip? Was this solitude, this endless sorrow, finally unraveling me? The manifestations grew bolder. I'd be meticulously patching a crack in the plaster, and the scent of my wife's rosewater perfume would waft past me, so potent I'd involuntarily turn, expecting to see her standing there. Then it would vanish, leaving behind only the acrid smell of plaster dust. I started talking to myself more, muttering explanations, trying to anchor myself to reality. It's the old pipes, I'd insist, or the wind playing tricks. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the sprawling, unlit basement. My flashlight beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, each more desolate than the last. There was a section, deeper within, where the walls were solid stone, interrupted by heavy, ironclad doors, each one bolted shut from the outside. The very atmosphere in that part of the basement was suffocating, crushing, as if all sound and light had been systematically drained from it. I pulled back, a profound unease settling over me. What could have been kept in such a place? I resolved to investigate that section of the basement properly, but not tonight. Back upstairs, a fresh wave of determination spurred me on. I had to understand what was happening. I returned to the main hall, where I'd been working to remove a particularly stubborn, ornate wooden paneling from the wall. My crowbar, usually a tool of blunt force, now became an instrument of precision. I carefully prized away the surrounding trim, revealing a faint seam in the wood that had been meticulously concealed. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the leather surprisingly cool to the touch. It was a journal, its pages brittle, filled with elegant, looping script. The date on the first page read 1847. I carried it to the flickering light of the fireplace, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The journal belonged to a distant ancestor, a woman named Elara Blackwood. Her early entries spoke of the manor's beauty, of her hopes for her family. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting became more frantic, the ink sometimes smudged as if by tears. She wrote of generations of Blackwoods, of their tragedies, their despair. It wasn't my sanity slipping. It was the manor. It was real. And it had been here for centuries, waiting. The journal dropped from my numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. My wife's laugh, my child's voice. They weren't hallucinations. They were lures. And I, in my deepest sorrow, had walked right into its ancient trap. The journal lay on the floor, a dark, heavy secret spilled onto the dust. My wife's laugh, my child's voice. The echoes weren't just memories. They were bait. A cold, clammy certainty settled over me, heavier than any grief I'd known before. This wasn't a descent into madness, it was an awakening to a different kind of reality, one far more terrifying. I knelt, my fingers trembling as I picked up the leather-bound book. The old paper felt fragile, almost crumbling beneath my touch, yet it held an immense, terrible weight. My breath hitched. I had to. This wasn't just about the manor anymore, it was about protecting whatever sanity I had left, about understanding the true enemy. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I opened the journal, flipping past the recent, frantic entries to the earlier, more methodical script. The handwriting shifted through generations, but the underlying narrative, once I learned to read past the archaic language and veiled metaphors, began to coalesce into a horrifying tapestry. My ancestors, it seemed, had been more than just eccentric. They were keepers, or perhaps, captives. It thrived on despair, grew fat on grief, and its presence, the journal hinted, deepened with each generation's sorrow. My family line, it seemed, was less a lineage and more a carefully cultivated crop of misery. One entry, written in a spidery, almost illegible hand, spoke of the balancing. When the hunger grows too great, it read, when the house groans with its yearning, a balancing must be struck. A deep sorrow, a pure anguish, offered to quiet the beast. It must be contained, lest it consume all. Another entry, bolder, more desperate, detailed the cycle of dormancy and awakening. It wasn't a one-time thing, it was perpetual. The entity would lie dormant, feeding subtly, until a critical mass of grief accumulated, at which point it would awaken fully, demanding a more potent offering to lull it back to sleep. And it was always a family member's grief. Always. My hands clenched, the journal crinkling slightly. My wife. My child. Had their loss. Had my unbearable grief. Awakened it? Was I the latest offering? I continued to read, my eyes scanning for any practical details, any way out. The stone holds fast against the gnawing. Another, the iron doors, sealed by ritual and prayer, hold the truth of our burden. The West Wing. I'd explored parts of it, found it mostly sealed off, crumbling, but below? I hadn't delved into the sub-basement levels there. The thought of what might be hidden beneath the decaying grandeur sent a shiver down my spine, but the determination remained. I rose from the armchair, the journal clutched tight. It knew I was close. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar I'd found in the workshop, I made my way to the West Wing. I descended a narrow, spiraling stone staircase I'd previously dismissed as a service passage, deeper and deeper into the manor's bowels. 3 heavy, riveted iron doors, each without a handle, were set into the rough stone walls. They looked medieval, designed for absolute containment. The air here was utterly still, devoid of even the faint currents that moved through the rest of the manor. My flashlight beam played over the central door. It was thicker, more heavily reinforced than the others, crisscrossed with faded, geometric carvings that looked less like decoration and more like wards. This was it. This was the deep place. This was where the quieted ones were kept. The carvings felt rough, almost abrasive. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a purpose-built structure, designed to hold something. Something terrible. That's what they were. Not for people, not in the way a modern institution would use them. These were for containment, for separation, for forcing a profound, agonizing solitude. The manor wasn't just a house. It was a monstrous mechanism, a trap. And I, Victor, the grieving architect, was not here to restore it. I was here to feed it. The horror of it settled over me, a suffocating blanket. The manor wasn't just a house. It was a monstrous mechanism, a trap. I was here to feed it. The thought, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of my sorrow, igniting a strange, desperate resolve. I wouldn't be consumed. Not like this. That determination, I now realize, was a provocation. It was a challenge thrown into the maw of something ancient and hungry. The air in the study, already thick with the scent of aged paper and decay, grew heavy, cloying. The single lamp on my desk flickered, not a gentle waver, but a violent spasm, plunging the room into momentary darkness before snapping back on, brighter, harsher. A low, guttural moan vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to originate from deep within the manor's stone foundations, echoing the very despair I had brought with me. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, shocking drop that made my breath plume in front of me. Gooseflesh prickled my arms, raising a fine down. Then, he was there. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a perfect, shimmering recreation. It wasn't real. I knew it wasn't. But the illusion was so vivid, so real, my mind struggled to reconcile the knowledge with the aching desire to reach out, to touch her. My hands trembled, clenching into fists. "You're not real," I choked out, the words tasting like ash. Him form wavered, a ripple through imperfect image, and a flicker of something malevolent crossed his face before it settled back into sorrow. "I am as real as your guilt, Victor. My child." A tiny hand reached out, beckoning. A tear, hot and sharp, tracked a path down my cheek. This was torture, exquisite and precise. The entity was not just showing me my grief, it was weaponizing it, twisting the purest love I knew into a barb. The manor around me began to respond to this escalating torment. The heavy oak door to the study, which I had closed moments ago, slammed open with a deafening crack, hitting the wall with bone-jarring force. Bookshelves groaned, their contents rattling as if a tremor was shaking the very structure. A heavy, leather-bound volume slid from a top shelf, missing my head by inches, landing on the desk with a dull thud. This wasn't just psychological, it was physical, a tangible threat. The air grew thicker, pressing down on me, making it difficult to draw a full breath. The walls seemed to draw inward, the ceiling to lower. The room was shrinking, compressing, the illusion of my loved ones fading, replaced by a suffocating claustrophobia. I felt a phantom shove against my back, propelling me forward, out of the study, and down the long, unlit corridor. I stumbled, fighting for balance, my vision blurring at the edges. The air grew. Stale, metallic, heavy with the scent of dust and confined despair. I found myself in a narrow, unlit passage, the air dead still. The passage opened into a larger space, but it was not a grand hall, nor a common room. This was a nightmare made real, a brutalist cage. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entity hadn't just changed the atmosphere, it had reshaped the very fabric of the manor around me, creating this abominable prison. Each cell door had a small, grimy viewport, and as I stumbled past, I caught glimpses within. Not empty rooms, but fleeting, horrifying tableaus, a child's toy, broken and discarded, a single, desiccated rose, a scrap of my wife's favorite lace. Each glimpse was a fresh stab, a curated memory designed to inflict maximum pain. A searing pain erupted in my temple, as if an ice pick had been driven into my skull. The pain intensified, twisting, burning, a direct assault on my mind. Thoughts fragmented, memories shattered, a cacophony of agony and despair crashing over me. My body convulsed, muscles spasming uncontrollably. This was it. This was the harvest. The entity was trying to break me, to drive me to the edge, to consume the very essence of my despair. But even through the blinding pain, a flicker of that desperate resolve remained. I wouldn't yield. Not to this. I wouldn't let my sorrow become its feast. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the rough texture of the concrete beneath my fingers, on the metallic tang in the air, anything to ground myself, to fight back against the insidious mental assault. I was victor. And I was still here. The accusations still echoed, a phantom choir in the hollow space behind my eyes. I lay there on the cold floor of the study, gasping, tasting dust and the metallic tang of fear. My hands, still trembling, slowly dropped from my scalp, leaving faint trails where I'd clawed. It had tried to pull me under, to drown me in the very grief I'd brought to Blackwood Manor. But I hadn't broken. Not entirely. A raw, defiant spark flickered within me, fueled by an anger that was slowly eclipsing the terror. I pushed myself up, every muscle protesting, my head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. The study was still, the only sound the rattling of a loose pane in the window and my own ragged breathing. No more running, no more cowering. If this thing wanted me, it would have to fight for me. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumbled for the oil lamp on the desk, striking a match with a shaky hand. I picked up the journal, my gaze sweeping over the hurried, almost frantic script. The previous entries, filled with despair and fragmented ramblings, now seemed to hold a terrifying coherence. I turned past the last entry I'd read, searching for anything that might shed light on what had just happened, on what this thing truly was. They depicted a cycle, a serpentine coil ending in a figure, almost human, but indistinct, surrounded by swirling lines that seemed to emanate from a central point. And then, a word, scrawled repeatedly in the margins, almost obliterated by time, sorrow harvest. Below it, a new section, written in a different hand, perhaps an earlier ancestor, describing rituals, not for summoning, but for containment. The despair, a feast. The sorrow, a bridge. I traced the words with a trembling finger. The vessel, pure in its grief, binds the cycle. It wasn't a term I recognized from the estate's blueprints. But, crucible of the soul. I remembered a strange, walled-off section in the oldest wing, marked only as storage on the fated estate maps, but sealed with heavy, riveted iron doors that looked far too robust for mere storage. I'd always assumed it was a forgotten pantry or a coal cellar. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a deliberate, generational trap. I grabbed a heavy iron candelabra, its 3 candles flickering weakly, and ventured out of the study. My boots scuffed on the grimy flagstones. I found the section I remembered, a short, narrow passage ending in those formidable iron doors, now barely visible behind a thick shroud of cobwebs. The hinges were rusted solid, the bolts thick with age, but the sheer weight of the metal hinted at their purpose. These weren't for keeping things in, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach. These were for keeping things out. Or, perhaps, for keeping something contained within. With a grunt, I put my shoulder to the heavy iron, pushing. The ancient metal groaned, a sound like a tortured beast, and a cloud of dust exploded around me, making me cough. The candelabra's light barely pierced it, swallowed whole. I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air was dead, utterly devoid of movement, and the metallic scent was overpowering now, mingling with a cloying sweetness that made my gorge rise. Iron rings were set into the walls at various heights, some broken, others still intact, glinting malevolently in the flickering light. This was where they were held. This was where the offerings were prepared. My gaze fell upon faint etchings on one of the stone walls, almost worn away by time. They were symbols, repeating the same coiled serpent from the journal, interspersed with crude, stick-figure representations of human forms, each one bowed, broken. And at the end of the sequence, a larger, more detailed figure, its head thrown back, mouth open in a silent scream. Above it, a date, rendered in archaic numerals. A date that was today. The entity wasn't just feeding on my despair. It was completing a cycle. I was the final sacrifice. My profound grief, the gaping wound left by my wife and child, wasn't just attracting it, it was the key. This wasn't a random haunting. This was a deliberate, ancient mechanism, fueled by generations of sorrow, and I was the final component. The entity didn't just want to consume me, it wanted to trap me, to add my despair to its endless feast, completing the ritual that would bind it irrevocably to this place, to my lineage. But if there was a binding, there had to be an unbinding. If there was a ritual of completion, there had to be a counter-ritual. I scrambled for the fallen candelabra, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it again. The flickering light caught on a smaller, almost invisible inscription on the wall, tucked beneath the larger symbols. It mentioned a specific alignment, a particular time, the apex of the sorrow harvest, the very moment the entity sought to complete its ritual. It wouldn't be easy. It would require me to face the entity head-on, at its strongest. It would mean risking everything. They wanted a sacrifice? They would get a fight. I clutched the journal to my chest, my gaze sweeping over the desolate cells, then back to the faint, flickering light of the candelabra. I was terrified, yes, but a desperate, furious determination had taken root. I would not let my grief be its anchor. I would not be its final offering. I would prepare. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments from the journal, the whispers, the attacks. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a trap, a meticulously laid snare fueled by generations of despair. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the flagstones beneath my boots, a sound that felt less heard and more felt, deep in my bones. It was the sound of something ancient stirring, something finally given its due. My hands scrabbled in the gloom until my fingers closed around the cold metal of the fallen candelabra. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I righted it, the flickering flames casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the cold stone walls. This was it. This was the heart of it all. You failed him, Victor. I flinched, my eyes darting to the empty space beside me. But it wasn't empty. Not truly. They were indistinct, yet I felt their gaze, heavy and accusatory. You built their tomb. It solidified, not into a monster, but into something far worse, my wife, smiling, her eyes full of a warmth that tore at my soul. She reached out to me, her hand translucent, her voice a fragile echo. Victor? My hand trembled, nearly dropping the candelabra again. This was the entity's weapon, its cruelest trick. It wasn't trying to scare me with fangs and claws, it was trying to drown me in my own sorrow. Replaced by the innocent, laughing face of my child. My heart seized in my chest. Why won't you come play? A wave of nausea washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. Weak. Broken. You deserve this. But even as the grief threatened to consume me, a spark of pure, unadulterated rage ignited in my gut. This thing had feasted on my family's tragedy, on the suffering of generations. It sought to trap me, to make me another link in its chain of misery. Not now. Not after everything. I gripped the candelabra tighter, a hot wax dripping onto my hand. The journal. The counter-ritual. It wasn't about appeasement, it was about severance. Destroying its anchor. The old architect, the one whose journal I'd found, had written about a conduit, a binding point. My gaze swept around the small cell. There was nothing obvious. Just rough-hewn stone, a rusty bucket in one corner, and an ancient, decaying wooden stool. Then, my eyes fell on the far wall, where a section of stone looked subtly different. Inset. And carved into its center, barely visible under layers of filth, was a symbol. The air grew frigid, biting at my exposed skin. "There you are," I muttered, my voice hoarse but firm. I took a step towards the symbol, the ground seeming to resist my movement, as if unseen hands were pushing against my legs. The candelabra's flames flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. "Leave it. You cannot break what has been forged in sorrow," a chorus of voices shrieked, no longer mimicking my loved ones, but raw, inhuman. I reached the wall. The symbol was carved into a small, flat stone tablet, no larger than my hand, set into the larger block. It felt strangely warm to the touch, humming with a low, insidious energy. The anchor. The conduit for all the despair, the source of its power. The journal had spoken of breaking the chain. Not through prayer, but through a decisive act of will, focused on the nexus. I remembered the architect's frantic sketches, his desperate notes about disruption and release. With a sudden, violent surge, the entity lashed out. A force, invisible but potent, slammed into my chest, throwing me against the opposite wall. I gasped, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. My head hit the stone, a sharp pain blooming at my temple. I tasted blood. But even in the overwhelming blackness, I could still feel the hum, the vibrations, the hateful presence. It was stronger than ever, emboldened by my setback. No. I wouldn't give it that satisfaction. My hand scrabbled blindly on the cold floor, searching for the candelabra. My fingers brushed against its cold metal, then the smooth, cool surface of the fallen journal. My mind raced. The architect hadn't just written about the symbol, he'd written about how to break it. Something about a counter-vibration, a focused release of opposing will. And then I remembered. A specific passage, scribbled almost illegibly, the sound. The true death of despair. I found the candelabra, lifted it, and with a desperate flick of my thumb, the small lighter I carried in my pocket flared to life, illuminating the wicks. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting a defiant glow. It hated the light, hated my resolve. I looked at the symbol again, at the nexus. It wasn't about destroying the stone physically. It was about disrupting its energetic resonance. I remembered the architect's final, cryptic note, the vessel of sorrow, purified by sound. It was a rusted, dented metal bucket, caked with generations of grime. I grabbed it, ignoring the pain in my head. I raised the bucket high, my arm aching. This wasn't just metal, it was a symbol, a resonant cavity. A vessel. With every ounce of my will, I brought the bucket down, slamming its rim against the center of the carved symbol on the stone tablet. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rupture. A violent tremor shook the entire chamber. The ground lurched. The walls groaned. The air crackled with raw energy, and the stench of decay was momentarily replaced by something acrid, like ozone. The hum was gone. They were silent. Had it worked? Had I truly broken the chain? The world inverted. The shriek that had been tearing at my sanity abruptly imploded, sucking the air from my lungs. A deafening silence followed, a void more terrifying than any noise. I felt the floor lurch beneath me, a seismic shudder that rattled my teeth. My arm, still raised with the heavy, rusted bucket, sagged. The weight felt immense, suddenly impossible to hold. My knees buckled, and I collapsed, hitting the splintered floorboards with a dull thud. Dust, thick and ancient, puffed up around me, stinging my eyes, filling my nostrils with the scent of decay and disturbed earth. I lay there, chest heaving, every muscle screaming. The cold spots were gone. The disorienting flashes had ceased. The sickening stench of rot, though still faintly present, no longer assaulted me with the intensity of a physical blow. It was over, or was it? My mind, a frayed rope, struggled to comprehend. One moment, I was locked in a cosmic wrestling match, the next, this profound, unsettling quiet. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up, my vision blurring. The grand hall, where the final confrontation had taken place, was a disaster zone. The ornate plaster work on the ceiling had cracked, showering debris onto the marble floor. A massive chandelier lay shattered, its crystal shards glinting malevolently. Tapestries, once rich with history, hung in tatters, ripped from their mountings. Furniture lay overturned, splintered, as if a colossal, invisible beast had thrashed through the room. The very air felt thin, scourged, as if something vital had been violently ripped from it. I stumbled, a puppet with severed strings, through the wreckage. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a ghost of the entity's assault. My hands trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from the memory of the sheer, unadulterated malevolence I had faced. It was a tangible thing, a force that had sought to unravel me, to consume the very essence of my grief. I had fought it, not with strength, but with a desperate, primal refusal to surrender. It felt empty, desolate. But the emptiness was not a comfort. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled. I made my way down to the basement, driven by an instinct I couldn't articulate. I found myself drawn to a section I hadn't truly explored before, a heavy, ironclad door set into a recessed archway, almost seamlessly blending with the rough-hewn rock. It wasn't like the other cellar doors, this one was built for absolute containment. My hands, still shaking, fumbled with the ancient, rusted latch. It groaned, protesting, before finally giving way. My stomach churned. These weren't storage rooms. These were cells. I approached the first cell door. Through the grimy, barred slit, I could just make out a bare, stone interior. No bed, no furniture, just a small, raised platform that might have served as a bench. On the far wall, scratched deeply into the stone, were crude, repetitive symbols, twisted spirals, jagged lines, and a repeating motif that looked unsettlingly like a weeping eye. They weren't random graffiti, they were etched with a frantic, desperate energy. As I moved to the next cell, my light caught something on the floor, just beneath the barred opening. I knelt, pushing my face close to the cold metal. It was a small, desiccated leather-bound journal. Its cover was brittle, its pages yellowed and warped. My fingers, trembling, managed to pry it open. The script inside was faded, almost illegible in places, but one entry, dated generations ago, stood out, etched into the page with a force that had almost torn the paper. The despair is insatiable. It feeds on their broken minds, their silent screams. We bring them here, to the deep places, to contain the madness, to focus the anguish. The architects of sorrow. Our family's burden. The ritual binds it, but only if the vessel is pure, truly shattered. They watch, they listen, they grow. The cells hold the bodies, but never the despair. My breath hitched. My own lineage. The manor wasn't just a place of haunting, it was a carefully constructed prison, a crucible, a machine designed to cultivate the very despair that fueled the entity. My ancestors hadn't been trying to banish it, they had been feeding it, perhaps believing they were controlling it, or that it was a necessary evil to keep something worse at bay. But the journal implied they were complicit, active participants in a horrifying cycle. The words, "the ritual binds it, but only if the vessel is pure," truly shattered, resonated with a sickening clarity. My wife and child. My grief. I was the perfect vessel, the ultimate sacrifice. They hadn't banished it, they had just made sure it had a fresh supply. The entity hadn't been a random manifestation, it was the culmination of generations of orchestrated suffering. I backed away from the cells, the journal clutched in my hand, my mind reeling. The horror was no longer an external threat, but a stain on my very bloodline. The manor was not just a house, it was a mausoleum of engineered agony. The entity might be gone, but its roots ran deeper than I could have ever imagined, entwined with the very foundations of Blackwood Manor and my family's cursed legacy. The battle was over, but the war, I realized, had been lost generations ago. What future could I possibly have, knowing this? What purpose could Blackwood Manor ever serve, other than as a monument to unending horror? The question hung in the stale, frigid air, heavy and inescapable. My breath hitched, but it wasn't from fear anymore. Not exactly. It was a gasp of awful clarity, a sickening click of understanding that locked every piece of the puzzle into place. My own lineage, my family, had built this monstrous engine of sorrow. They hadn't been victims, they had been something else. Either architects of their own damnation, or unwitting cogs in a larger, more insidious design. A cold rage, sharper than any grief, began to simmer in my gut. I wouldn't be another link in their chain. I wouldn't feed this thing. I wouldn't let my sorrow, my profound, crushing loss, become its banquet. Determination, brittle but unyielding, settled over me. I moved through the manor, no longer tiptoeing, no longer flinching at every creak. My footsteps echoed with a new purpose. The air still hummed with a low, oppressive drone, a silent thrumming against my eardrums, but I pushed through it. The source. The heart of the machine. The stone walls here were rougher, cruder, less finished than the upper levels, testament to their utilitarian, horrific purpose. I reached the entrance to the segregation unit isolation cells. The heavy, iron-barred door, a relic of an era I didn't want to contemplate, stood ajar, just as I'd left it. I pushed it open fully, the groan of the hinges a protest against my intrusion. The air hung stagnant, heavy with the ghosts of countless agonies. I walked past the empty cells, each one a testament to calculated cruelty, designed to strip away hope and cultivate despair. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't destroy the entity itself, it wasn't a physical thing. But I could destroy its feeding ground. I could dismantle the mechanism that produced its sustenance. As an architect, I understood structures, their weaknesses, their points of failure. This entire section of the manor, these cells, they were a conduit. They were designed to channel despair. My gaze fell upon the central chamber, where the ritual had taken place, where the energy converged. The stone altar, still scarred with ancient markings, seemed to radiate a faint, malevolent warmth. Around it, the floor was etched with intricate patterns, channels carved into the rock, like veins leading to a monstrous heart. It was a system. A plumbing for sorrow. I found the structural weak points, the keystone in this grotesque architecture. Not in the walls of the cells themselves, but in the foundation beneath the central chamber, where the carved channels converged. My hands, surprisingly steady, found a loose section of the floor near the altar, a heavy stone slab that had been expertly fitted, but not mortared. It was a maintenance hatch, a way to access the deeper workings of this infernal machine. With a grunt, I leveraged it open. A deeper, fouler stench billowed up, a mix of decay and something else, something ancient and cloying. My stomach twisted, but I pushed down the revulsion. This was it. I couldn't see what was down there, but I didn't need to. I needed to seal it. To cut off the flow. I grabbed a pickaxe I'd brought from my workshop, a heavy, blunted tool, and began to hack at the surrounding stone, not at the slab itself, but at the foundation around it. My intention was not to destroy the entity, but to collapse its access point, to bury the mechanism under tons of earth and rock. To seal it off, permanently. Dust and grit filled the air, stinging my eyes. With each swing, I poured my grief, my anger, my desperate resolve into the effort. The entity fought back, subtly at first. "You can't escape us, Victor. You're ours now." I ignored them. I focused on the stone, on the physical act of destruction. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned, but I kept going. Dust erupted, and the heavy stone slab I'd opened earlier tilted, then crashed down into the chasm, followed by a cascade of rubble. The slurping sound abruptly ceased, replaced by a muffled thud. I stood panting, covered in dust, my body aching. It felt empty. Vanquished. I spent the next few days in a daze, methodically sealing off the entire underground section, bricking up the entrance to the cells, burying the horror under layers of concrete and reinforced steel. I worked until my hands bled, until my mind was numb with fatigue, until the last vestige of that terrible place was inaccessible, entombed beneath the manor. When I finally emerged, blinking into the pale sunlight, the manor felt different. Quiet. Empty, but not in the same menacing way. The air was crisp, the birds sang. It was over. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. I decided to stay. To rebuild, not just the manor, but my life within it. It was still my ancestral home, scarred but cleansed. I started with the upper floors, letting in light, stripping away the decay. I found a strange, almost detached satisfaction in the work. The grief was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it no longer threatened to consume me. I felt free. Months passed. The manor slowly transformed under my hands. I hired a few local builders, careful to keep them away from the sealed-off lower levels. I even started to sketch new designs, not for the manor itself, but for other projects, feeling the familiar stir of creativity. Life, against all odds, was returning. I held a glass of amber liquid, watching the flames. A sense of peace, fragile but real, enveloped me. I thought of my wife, my child, and for the first time in years, the memories were bittersweet, not solely agonizing. It wasn't sadness, or anger, or even the exhaustion of my ordeal. It was a profound, calculating emptiness. My gaze lingered on my reflection, and I saw it, a subtle shift in the light, a flicker in the depths of my pupils. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, like a distant, dying ember, deep within my own eyes. And then, I felt it. A quiet hum, not in the air, but within my own mind. It was a quiet, satisfied contentment, a patient waiting. It wasn't gone. It had merely found a new vessel. A new architect. And I, Victor, was already drawing plans.